Hey, Temple. Okay, let us start for today. Welcome again to the Queer Politics webinar. Hopefully you can hear me. Maybe a thumbs up from, yes, good, I can see Dan, excellent. Thank you so much for joining us again. Very excited today to welcome Sean Howell, who will be talking through some fascinating research in a second. Couple of announcements. My name is Andy Reynolds. Wanted to let you know that next week we will be taking a bye week on the webinar. Unfortunately, I am moving from North Carolina to New Jersey, and one of the move days is next Thursday. So unfortunately, we're gonna skip next week. And then we have some fabulous new additions to the schedule, including Andrea Jenkins, who is the Minneapolis Council Vice President and the first African-American trans woman elected in the United States, who will be with us later on in the fall. Some terrific scholarship from Russia, from Britain, and from the rest of the world, and the US as well. So look at the schedule. I also importantly wanted to update you on our friend Tariq Zaidan, who gave us a terrific presentation last week. Tariq, as you know, is in Beirut, the director of Howell, the leading LGBT organization in the Middle East and in Lebanon. I've posted an update from Tariq, who is safe and healthy and uninjured. I believe that his house was totaled in the blast, and certainly Howell's offices have been dramatically, if not destroyed, injured. And you'll read the update from Tariq on my Facebook post and perhaps on Twitter as well. So Tariq and his friends and colleagues are well. They were not injured in the blast, fortunately, unlike many other thousands of people, but their organization has been dramatically upended by the blast, which was just across the main road from the port where the blast happened. So that's an update on our presenter from last week. As I said, I'm very excited this week to welcome Sean Howell, who is a co-founder of the Hornet social media site, social network, and the CEO of the LGBT Foundation. And Hornet and the LGBT Foundation and Sean have been doing some terrific work, which revolves around really identifying the reality of the community, of the numbers of the people in America who are now able to identify in some way as LGBTQ or fluid. And Sean is going to take us through some of their recent research, which looks at this much larger community, which in some ways identifies with the queer world, even if they don't necessarily articulate it in that way. And to me, this research is so crucial because without a significant purchase on the reality of the community size, we don't know really where we should be, what we're playing with. I was very interested in talking to Sean and have Sean talk to us after Gabrielle and I published some work about the primary electorate in March in the United States, which found that about 10% of the voters were identifying as LGBT. This actually adds a significant chunk to that, something that I think Sean will refer to as Q+ or queer plus. So without further ado, I hand it over to Sean, and we'll do around about half an hour of presentation and questions again. Email me if you'd like to ask a question, and I'll hand it over to Sean. So thank you.
I'm very happy to be here, and this is really some fun research for me to present. And in the course of doing this, you know, I've been a gay activist for a very long time. It was one of the reasons I started Hornet, which is a gay social network I'll talk about a little bit more later. Who we identify as is something that's very personal to all of us. And I thought I had a good sense of that and do lots of research on the community, whether it's political or mental health or HIV. And I think now that I'm 40, I can also identify with people who sometimes feel that they're out of touch. And what I'm going to argue today is that most marketers are very much out of touch because this is market research, although it's very rigorous. And oftentimes I think market research can be more rigorous than a lot of academic research. And this will be very convicting to marketers. It will be very convicting to people who are in the LGBT community about how big we are, how we identify, how do we define who is gay or lesbian. And it can be very exciting. There are very few people, it might be a little bit insulting, but I think I'll get away with it. So I talked about how marketers may seem out of touch. And I think one thing that's important is that we see journalists, gay activists, everyone often lean on this number that the LGBT community might be 5% of the population. You see it referenced in Wall Street Journal, Forbes, everywhere. It just comes up again and again. And Andrew's research clearly shows that you can just do a very surface level and somehow get a much bigger number. But the numbers I'm going to present are even more surprising. And one of the things that I'll share is around this idea of labels and how the labels that we've used as activists have limited how we think about our community. And I think you don't have to just use your own experience with being LGBT. You can think about what it means to be a Democrat or what it means to be a Republican or rich or poor and how limiting those labels are. And if you were just to write a book and that was your only identity, not only would that book be very short, but it'd be very wrong. And I think you can, when you think about presidential nominees for the Democratic Party, they come in many flavors. So simply calling someone a Democrat is clearly a mislabeling in itself. Before I move on, maybe I'll just share a little bit about the data and Kantar and how we came up with this. I'll go into the methods later because I think it's interesting. I know some of the academics that are on this call will lean to want to know that the most. But Kantar, if you're not familiar with market research companies, it's essentially one of the largest. It's a $4 billion company with 30,000 employees and offices in 100 countries. Hornet is a 30 million user gay social network. It's mobile, it's in 27 languages. It has #1 market share in France, Brazil, Russia, Taiwan, Turkey, the Philippines, Egypt, many more. And I'll talk about the data that we have. It's robust as well. And then I'll end with the methods section today. So what you're going to hear is how the LGBT community is 32 million, which is a staggering percentage of the population. That's 13% of the United States. You've seen reporting on this over the years that will hint at how we came to this number. And it's essentially not just about how people identify, but also how outdated our understanding of identity is. And simply by asking a single punch question, what is your sexual orientation, we definitely get the wrong conclusion. So if you look at our community, we have 17% of the population, or 7% of the population, 17 million, who if you ask them, are you lesbian, gay, bi, trans, they will say yes. And if you ask other questions, are you attracted to same-sex people? Do you have other behavior that's not heteronormative? That's a a similar size number of the population at 15 million. I'll go into those questions a little bit later and kind of share something that's even far more interesting, and that's how this number has changed over time and for generations. So if you look at baby boomers, 8% of the population identifies as LGBTQ+, and Gen X, 13%, millennials, 20%, and centennials, 30%. And that last number is really interesting for us to talk about because for all kinds of reasons, we didn't ask anyone under the age of 17. So the numbers here are only inclusive of 18 and above. And so that's not just a shifting of attitudes, that's about how things have changed for the younger generation, how they get to live their true identity. And for baby boomers, many still can't. It's quite a sad thing to actually contemplate. There's a flip side to this, which is thinking about how many people use the label gay or lesbian. And of course, these numbers mirror the last set of data that I just showed. And so you see a larger percentage of kind of early wave LGBT activists who use the labels, and now the younger generation are labelless. I'm going to share this data and some links on how to get it. I'll post it to my Twitter, which is Howell for Change, and you can get it on ResearchGate. But here, kind of in the cross comparison, because I break this down later, one thing that's true across the board is that we have a flight to urban centers, and the kind of nuances between some of these I'll break down into individual topics. So my main objective for this research when we commissioned this project was to try to communicate to chief marketing officers, because the market size is $1 trillion, similar to many other large polycultural marketing demographics like African American or Asian American. And at $1 trillion, you should see a large proportion of ad budgets. And I would argue that our community has a love-hate relationship with marketers. But it's much too small. And so as a marketing executive, they really don't know who their audience is or how to talk to them. And you see a lot of the behaviors of the Q+ community closely mirroring the LGBT community. I'll go into this a little bit later, and I think had I done this research today, these numbers would not only be a little bit different, but I would focus on them in a much stronger way. But if you think about LGBTQ+ of color, the importance for brands to help support the additional discrimination that community feels and experiences can be reflected in their brand messaging and making more inclusive messaging and representation. So we shouldn't just have LGBTQ+ advertising that's very white. If we ask people who have an intersectionality of discrimination, we see those elements multiply. So whether that's being African American and also LGBTQ+, or African American with a disability and being LGBTQ+. The idea that our research questions, advertising, other factors in life, move to erase identities of LGBTQ people. That's additionally true for a variety of LGBTQ people of color. Here, I'm not going to spend too much time because I can break down many different communities within our community. But there are striking differences, and I think those differences reflect elements within that community, different internal stigmas that exist, but also external factors on the community. And so you can see strong differences between using the labels gay and lesbian, as well as who identifies as Q+, and perhaps other pressures like the pressure to be married, etc. And so you see, for example, Asian Americans who identify as LGBTQ+, the stronger percentage identifying as Q+. And one interesting factor is for lesbians, or women, not lesbians, the number of people who identify as Q+ is even higher. While for men, it's lower. So that's a fascinating thing for us to maybe get into the discussion questions. So I'll talk about the methodology and some of the drivers for this, and perhaps some of the drivers for asking incorrect questions to begin with. So a single punch question for sexual orientation is, are you gay, bisexual, or lesbian? So here we're not conflating trans with sexual orientation. And then a spectrum question or scalar is that how do you think about your sexual identity and not having a single, I'm 100% straight, for example, and then sexual behavior. And when we ask these questions, that is what creates a very different outcome. And I think for a variety of reasons, over the years, we've pushed to have labels. I think from an activist perspective, the label has been a place of strength. It's like identifying as a Republican or a Democrat, but it also excludes people. They may like to even be a part of that community, but for a variety of reasons, may feel excluded. If you think about, how far advertising has come along, for example, maybe on racial factors, we were more inclusive, but for body image, less inclusive. And so there's still a variety of things that make the community non-welcoming. And then if we look at from a behavioral perspective, you don't need to go to a pride parade or a gay bar to be queer. There's many different experiences, whether you're a radical queer fairy and you live in the woods, or you simply have a very different life that's just inclusive of loving someone of the same sex, but not participating in the other parts of the community. So I think for the political activist side, which often makes news stories, we've left this off the table. From an academic perspective, much of the research, and funding for research around the community is often about health risks. And here, I think the research is very guided to a single perspective about who's at risk for, say, HIV and what it means to be part of that community. And I think in those questions, that may be valid and true. Like, you know, if you have gay men who have anal sex are at higher risk. But if we think of, we shouldn't then think that that somehow is estimating the population of gay men by looking at gay men who just have anal sex. And so I think there's a big danger and consequence for years of rigorous research that is counting anal sex and using that as our identity. And that even in those questions, people are still being excluded who maybe should be included. So I hope both for politics, for marketing, and for health, we think about this in a much broader sense, because queer people often experience not just risk for HIV, but mental health. And so if we think about services that need to be created for our community and exclude the Q+, we're leaving half of our community outside the room, and we need to find ways to bring them into the room. Here's some links on how you can get the research, and I'll post them on Twitter after the talk as well.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Sean. This is a lot of food for thought amongst many of us who study the numbers in various ways. Certainly one of the things in the electoral field, voter identification, we seem to find is that the growth both here and in the UK is amongst women, cisgendered women who identify as bisexual or pansexual. That seems to be the biggest growth area of younger women identifying, which is very much in line with what you're saying. Got a number of questions coming up. I'd like to start with Andrew Flores, who I'm sure you know from Williams and from American University, who's worked in this field as well. So Andrew, you can kick us off with your comments and questions.
Thanks. I have a few, so I'll just kind of rattle them off a little bit. First, of course, I think it's important to acknowledge that many of the social scientists who have been studying population-based data around sexual orientation and gender identity have conceptualized these constructs in these 3 dimensions with a clear exposition and recommendation to researchers that they operationalize their concepts consistent with what they are seeking to examine and understand. So if you're focusing on studies of sexual behavior, say in the health context with HIV, then that is the construct of sexuality that you're trying to operationalize. Whereas for those of us who do more in political science, that maybe there is some relevance to self-identifying as LGBT that is politically relevant. And so I think there are usefulness of having these approaches to understanding sexuality, and that people have examined them on those dimensions. So I just want to put that out there, that I think that work has been done and that people do advocate for thinking about sexuality in a multidimensional way. So that's just a broad comment, but a couple of questions. One, of course, is with your data. You didn't really discuss the sampling strategy. Is this an online panel? Is this a telephone survey? I'm concerned about representativeness of the sample.
Yeah.
So, I have a few more. Additionally, say sample size, confidence in any of these point estimates that you've provided. It would be interesting and fascinating for you to kind of separate, say, the LGBT identifiers and potentially also present results on the transgender community that you didn't necessarily present, unless if they're kind of thrown into the Q+. and to see if there are distinctions between those who self-identify and those who say have attractions or behaviors that you would say put into Q+. As you think about broadening this concept of community, I wonder if it's also important to draw out that there are distinctions and differences as heterogeneity in that community, and that might be really important. And also, similarly, how much do people see themselves as a part of a queer community? And does that fall along different dimensions of self-identification versus attraction versus behavior? And then also, what are the implications of that, say, for marketers, or implications for that for those of us who think about the political effect of, say, sexuality or gender? And I'll stop there.
Absolutely. If I miss some points, I'll come back to them and we can make it conversational. And I think for many, the discussion you and I may have just now will be probably the more interesting part of the talk. And I'll even do it almost in an adversarial way just to kind of make it more interesting. But I love the Williams Institute and of course your work, and I'm a big fan of it. So is this rigorous? This is as rigorous as market research gets. So if you want to think that market research is bullshit, then this is bullshit. But Kantar's just about as good as you can get. They try to make this sample representative. The size is 13,000. The LGBTQ plus part of it is from a broader set. So it's from the trying to look at trends in the United States. And that's how this came up with. And I'll share the data and stuff at the end, so people can look at that and understand its limitations. In thinking about labels and things, I do think, and I meant to point this out more specifically earlier. Here we've spoken of LGBTQ+, and as this chart shows, this kind of labels just doesn't make sense. And I would argue it doesn't make sense from a political perspective, unless you're a baby boomer. Like, it's just every single generation after baby boomers, it's less and less. Or the next slide kind of illustrates that more. But here the trend, we're not conflating sexual orientation and being trans. So that's broken down in the research. It's just that this is the label that the community has often talked about. This is the label that marketers use. And using LGBTQ+ is perhaps a temporary solution. And I don't know how to propose what we should call the community. And maybe Soji will take off. I just don't know. So I think that's the real identity here that we're talking about is LGBTQ+ kind of.
Well, if I may have a quick follow-up, but to use the term identity for those that may not say that they actually identify is also potentially problematic, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's go to Sam Ritholtz.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sean, for such a good presentation. I'm actually just going to pick up right where Andy left off, because I think I actually have a similar question of the same vein. So most of us on here are academics, but we're not necessarily all numbers people. And so I'm actually a theorist. And so in reading or listening to your research, which I understand has this marketing background, I think it was quite provocative. And I think a lot of the reasons why it was so provocative are reasons that you enumerate in your introduction, that this is something that really challenges how we define the community, of how we understand the politics of identity. And you conclude by saying that you think there's a risk in ignoring this Q+ population. But just going on this previous conversation, I do wonder if there's this risk of conflating or assuming that behavior impacts identity, and whether this behavior alone constitutes inclusion within this quote unquote community. And that's more of a political question or a theoretical question, which I think does answer or does begin this conversation of whether just because someone exhibits these behaviors, it could be problematic to assume they're part of this community. And so when you were setting up this introduction and then presenting this material, you said that this flexible group actually, that's for lack of a better term, this group that exhibits these behaviors but doesn't necessarily identify has similar preferences to people who do identify as LGBTIQ. But in your data, I mean, I did cut out for a few seconds, but I didn't really see any of that data presented. And I think that actually might be really interesting if you could talk about it a bit, just to understand, okay, maybe this group doesn't identify as LGBTIQ+, but here are the ways that besides their behaviors that they are relating or interacting with this group that does identify. And if there were differences, that would be very interesting as well. Thank you.
I think that that's a great bit of research to explore. And from here, the market research is that their buying patterns and habits and lifestyle are the same. Their political views, that they're more in line with the LGBT community than they are with a heteronormative community. So that's what the data shows. I think from a gender studies perspective, I think there's a huge amount of work here that needs to be done. And some gender studies people need to go find some epidemiologists and do this, because the market researchers shouldn't do this. This really, the kind of agenda of this research, and it has an agenda, and it was paid, this research was paid for by me to show the CMO of Coca-Cola that he doesn't know what he's doing at his job, and that his understanding and limit of the size of the community is too small. And even if you're looking at, those who self-identify, it's too small. But if you just go to a high school today, or you go on a Hornet profile, we see this changing. Did I take those slides out? Yeah, let me just pull up some additional slides. But someone can ask another question. I'm going to go find some more slides.
I think one other thing that we can put on the table, and I'll let other people weigh on this as well. But the question about, identification, as Andrew and as Sam have pointed out, is often revolves around your willingness to put yourself on a continuum if you have some same-sex attraction or same-sex experience. And then I don't know how much your data can get to this, but it would be interesting to think about to what extent are these people who are internally less policing themselves, less censoring themselves, versus an opening up of an external climate that just allows people to identify in these ways, honestly. So that internal self-censorship about same-sex attraction or experiences versus the communal space around you. Obviously, they're overlapping, they're reinforcing, but I don't know if you have any data, and we can take this question after you answer the first question, but any data around to what extent are people driven by suddenly opening up because they feel internally more comfortable, or the space around them is becoming more comfortable?
I think that's a both and. I think if you think about the experience of young people having other people that come out around them, I think there's other factors too. You think about technology and the ease of access. When I was a gay teenager, there wasn't a smartphone, and smartphones aren't even that old. You think 2009 is when people started getting smartphones, and an app like Hornet could even work. And what did the 18-year-old version of Sean have to do in 1950? He'd have to sit around at a truck stop and wait for someone. Like the reality and experiences that people get to have that are closer to their true self are easier for lots of reasons, not just political ease, but technology ease. And, that's what the social sciences get to look at. But if you think about it from a marketing's perspective, oh, we're way off on how we think about reality and how big the community is. There's additional people who've had similar results, and they should have more press and they should become seminal, but they just aren't. I don't know why this data isn't sticking around, but whether it's Nielsen or GLAD, a lot of people are kind of reproducing this kind of research. At Hornet, we've been reporting on it for a long time before we ever did this research. When we first started collecting this kind of data at Hornet, and this is really big data sets, 7% of our users chose to identify as something other than gay. And in Brazil, we allow hashtags the way Instagram has hashtags, and the most popular hashtag in Brazil is genderless. And that may mean something different in Brazil. I'm not gonna figure out exactly what to tell you is the true definition, but if I ask one of these users what they think it means, it really means that they don't fit the gender norm for them, like a boy liking a girl. They're a boy that likes a boy or also likes a girl. And so we've seen that number just grow by a lot. And that's not us changing the research question, that's just us growing and the users getting younger. And so that data kind of has mirrored what this Cantor research showed.
Actually, before I ask Howard to come in, just a clarification. Hornet itself, the constituency of your users, are they more cisgendered men? Are you more dealing to that group, or what's your user base?
Yeah, so it's really surprising. It's largely cisgender men, although about 13% may be trans.
Okay, great. Let's go to Howard Rosen.
Great, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Sean. First disclaimer, I'm not an academic, but I was struck by that trend in fluidity that you showed early in your presentation. And my question dovetails with what Andrew was just talking about, to ask whether this increased fluidity, is this a new phenomenon, or is this the expression of a latent but otherwise repressed phenomenon?
It's not apparent in the research because we're not time-lapsing the individuals. So I think that's, I'm sure someone has started to do that research somewhere, but if not, that someone's that make a great PhD thesis. I think there's many things here. And I think the concept of fluidity too is something that we ask people, they might not identify with this kind of academic term. It's just like the term queer. If you ask people if they like it, no one wants to be called queer except, gay and lesbian professors at Princeton. Like it's a radical term and it means something very different. So I think what is clear is that the opportunities for younger people to express this part of themselves exist today. And for whatever reason, it's not existing for baby boomers.
Great. Just a point of information. I think actually the only people at Princeton using the term queer are bisexual professors, but I can't speak for the others. Let's turn to Liz Barker, who has a comment question.
Hi, hello, Sean. Thank you so much for that. That was enormously interesting. And and in a way very consistent with another data set, which was in 2017, the United Kingdom government did its LGBT survey. It was an LGBT survey. And of the many 110,000 people, big response to that, of the many things that came out of that and were surprising were the number of people who identified as non-binary. We had almost as many people identify as non-binary as identified as trans. We had, I think, 4% of respondents said they were pansexual. No, clearly there's a difference to a survey which is designed to flog Coca-Cola and a government survey, but they're both very important. The point that, and this links back to Andrew Flores's question, is about the methodology, because you need to ask the questions in a way that relates to some outcomes that are going to come down the track. The UK government was asking questions in order that services such as health or changes in the law would happen for that population. Now, the interesting and the most interesting part of it is when we go beyond definitions of LGBT, questions of legal change and what people need to change in society in order to make their lives better becomes a whole area that is got to be explored much further. Interestingly, what the UK government did, and I was part of helping them do it, was to set up smaller working groups to try to talk further with people who identified as non-binary about what it was that they needed to change in the law. So my question to you is, coming at this from, and I should just say, all of that work was very important in determining what the questions will be in the next census on gender identity and fluidity, and that's really, really important one. But my question is, having gone through this exercise of trying to establish how people identify, what is it that you then say to companies about, well, how do you use that to then link to a particular change that is beneficial to that community? Sorry.
A great question. And I think it will be illuminating to some of the academics on this call. And if you go to my ResearchGate later, you'll see I do really boring research, and I've done population estimates, where I've looked at, the methodology of estimating how many gay men there are in the world, the same way the zoologist counts red pandas in the forest. And I think it's great and helpful to kind of think about what the purpose and power of market research might be, and often how fast it is versus academic research can take a long time to get funded, collect, propose a thesis, IRB, and go and get done. Where market research, you pay for it, you go get it, and it gets published or used. And so this kind of market research from a company like Kantar, this is being used by Audi to sell more cars. This is used by NBC to figure out what kind of TV shows they need to make. I mean, this is really powerful stuff. And, laws take a long time to change, but, this kind of research can change, how many genderqueer people are on MTV. And so that's what this research ends up being used for in these market research companies. And so it's really fascinating, and be surprised how diligent those researchers are. And some of their methodology might not fit yours, but it may also have more rigor than academia sometimes, because they are trying to look and balance and weight populations in ways that academics often just can't even afford to go get those kinds of data sets.
Let's take a question from Martin Nano.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, thanks for the presentation. My name is Martin. I am a PhD student at UNC. I mean, it's obviously, I've always found this research on kind of or not discrepancy necessarily, but the large number of people who do exhibit, non-exclusively straight behavior sexual behavior not identifying with, as like LGBT. And so I was wondering if you or anyone really here actually does know of some research. I'm sure that there probably is some on like certain, personality or ideological underpinnings or drivers of actually what leads one to identify versus not identify when they display such behavior. Because, in terms of a non-sexual behavior, and this, is not an enlightening point because, both Andy Flores and Andy Reynolds mentioned it, at least, as some people got to it as well, is that this is a hypothesis because I haven't looked at that research if it exists, but I would imagine that the people the people who do not identify but do display the non-straight behavior, so what society deems like is a non-straight behavior, do have certain they do not exhibit other behaviors. I would imagine that in terms of what you mentioned, TV shows, I wonder if those people actually do prefer RuPaul's Drag Race as much as identifying gay men do, or I wonder if they go to the queer or gay bars, or if they wear the same clothes as or not. In other words, it's not. I wonder if it's just simply about also cisgendered men, or if it's also that those people who do have say men who have sex with men but do not identify as bi or gay. I wonder if they're just also more ideologically conservative and perhaps other personality traits.
I think in some ways, some market research captures that because they look at people's, willingness to take risk, how soon they make purchases, how much money they keep in their savings accounts, all those kinds of things. But I think from your perspective, that's really more of a gender theory type question. And I wouldn't know the right thing to point you to now, but maybe someone else could put it in the chat or tweet to us later about it.
Great. Let's go to Dan Pinello.
Thank you, Sean. I just want to make a comment that it seems to me that somehow we're coming full circle, because even in the socially repressive 1940s and 50s, empiricist Alfred Kinsey himself came up with a 6-point scale with regard to sexual orientation. So at least from that academic perspective, it's been more nuanced for half a century or more than just simply straight or gay. And so I think we're again returning to a place that some research a long time ago began. Thanks again.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and I should have done a better job of kind of linking that. I think both partly gay politics and the funding for HIV research kind of filled up the room. And then if you can go find this well-funded, highly rigorous study by really great scientists that show, some population, gay men, 3% having anal sex or something, then that gets misused and then becomes quoted, and then just journalists and how they understand data and stuff is also just something I think we can do a better job at. And I think I could map out how much of this wrong data is out there, and it might be right for that purpose, but it's really being taken out of context, I think, politically and in business. And I would argue that the business component is super important. How many ads have gay couples? That's totally different than an ad that is genderqueer. And this research isn't staying in a closet. Kantar's not asleep now. They're taking this and putting it in front of people and telling them to change their advertisings. And I think after that happens, then we'll see all this other stuff limp along too. I'm going to give an opportunity for anybody else to come up with final questions.
while people are thinking, I wanted to pose this to you, Sean. The British Australian activist, gay activist, Peter Tatchell, has always said that he believes that in his lifetime, or in the fullness of time, the terms gay and straight will become moribund, and everybody will effectively identify on a continuum of same-sex versus different sex, cisgendered versus transgendered attraction. And he actually thinks that the trend is to a continuum, to fluidity across the board without those binaries or even 1 or 2, 3 categories. Are you, from your studies, from your research, is that the way you think things will go?
I think if you walk into a high school or junior high, we would seem like old farts who just don't know what we're talking about. Like they just, the #1 hashtag on Hornet in Brazil is genderless. Like it's already happened, and I don't know how to talk about it, but I know it's there.
Well, that's true. I don't have to walk into a high school to be considered an old fart. It's pretty common in every audience that I come into. And I do, just to close, I mean, from my personal experience, I feel like I'm a rare, one of those red pandas, because as a boring, white, middle-aged, bisexual man who isn't a celebrity singer or actor, I mean, it's pretty rare that, people who are over 50, who are in mainstream legitimate activities identify as bisexual or pansexual. And I think that's one of the interesting things that your data is picking up, this trend of people who are millennials and younger, to be comfortable with that when over 50, over 40, that's really not a thing for many people. And I wonder, one final question to you is, do you think that the trend of younger people identifying as fluid will in some way pollinate older people to be able to identify as fluid?
We can hope so. I think young people stand on the shoulders of those who came before them, but maybe, strangely, it will be the reverse for a change.
Right, great. Well, we do greatly appreciate your time and your data and your work and your presentation today, Sean. Thank you. And I hopefully we'll all stay in touch and we can communicate as we move forward and continue these fascinating studies. I did want to actually correct what I said right at the start. Next week is not the bye week. Next week, we actually have the fabulous law professor from UC Berkeley, Russell Robinson, who's going to talk to us about some of the legacy of Obergefell and marriage equality in the United States, and also talking about African-American queer communities and their reaction to marriage equality. So next week is Russell Robinson from UC Berkeley. We'll take a bye week after that. So keep safe, keep well. If anybody would like to contact Tariq in Beirut, then we can certainly, I'll send out his contact details, and just to remind everybody that he is safe and well, even though the organization has been very hard hit by the bombing. So thank you again, Sean, and we'll be in touch, and everybody keep well for next week, and hopefully we'll see you next Thursday. So goodbye, bye-bye.